Strange, yet true stories. Tales from the light side, the dark side, and the other side. I'm Steve White. Bigfoot. Sasquatch, also known as Bigfoot, has been talked about and painted on the walls of caves for centuries. Every continent on Earth has their own name and personal stories of these elusive creatures. Every year, there are over 5,000 sightings of Bigfoot, yet it's still considered a myth. Here are 5 true submitted stories that might make you a Bigfoot believer. 1. Strange story. Sasquatch in a crate. My grandfather told me this story back in 1991, a few years before he passed away. And so it goes. My grandfather worked as a landscaper on the Duke Estate in Somerset, New Jersey from the late 1950s to the early 1970s. When he told this story to my sister and me, he was foggy when giving the exact dates, but he was still very sharp and explained with clarity all the details. My grandfather's job was to manicure and care for the lawns in the north section of the property and other various duties. He said that in the summer of 1972, one August afternoon, he was told by the head groundskeeper that he would be working overtime and that he was needed because a shipment was being delivered from Wisconsin. They needed about 8 men to unload a crate and to bring it into the garden area. That night, the truck arrived and it was getting late. The men who were asked to stay for overtime were eager to get things done and over with and be on their way. When the truck pulled up, my grandfather said that the crate was about 8 feet tall and 5 feet wide. When he asked what was inside it, the one in charge said they were exotic trees. What happened next was enough to make half of the team get up and walk off the job and not care about the consequences. When the men started pushing the crate off of the flatbed truck, a blood-curdling scream was unleashed from within the box. All of the men let go of their grip, and the crate fell to the floor. As everyone jumped back, realizing that this was anything but a tree, the head groundskeeper did all he could to save the contents' real identity and said that there was a black bear inside of it. While the men were regaining their composure, most of the help walked off the job. They said they didn't want to get hurt or mauled dealing with a wild animal without the proper safety equipment, so off they went, including my grandfather. Only 2 men stayed to finish what they were asked. This is what was told to my grandfather. The 2 remaining men managed to get the load onto a dolly and then drag it into the garden compound. While guiding the crate down the main path, balance was lost, and the crate came off the wheels. The crate hit hard enough to crack the side of the crate and loosen the side panel, which fell off and exposed the contents. What the 2 remaining men witnessed that night was enough to make them seek employment elsewhere. What I am telling you is how it was told to me. Inside the crate sat a creature that had the shape of a man, but was anything but a man. They couldn't give a height measurement since the creature was in a sitting position, but they said it was huge. It had the shape of a man with a very large frame, only it was covered with black hair. The creature was strapped down and had shackles on his legs and feet and arms. The face didn't look like a man, but had some human features. The workers said it looked more like a monkey or a gorilla. The hair was extremely long and dirty. At one point, one of the men said they thought that this thing was trying to speak or communicate with words, but all it did was keep on drooling. They were under the impression that this creature was heavily sedated because it couldn't keep its head up straight. It rested its head on its chest. A couple of inches away from the creature's head was an empty water bottle nailed to the wall. On the other side of the creature was an IV stand connected to the wall and stuck to its arm. It might have been used to feed this creature during its transport. One of the oddest parts to this story was that my grandfather was told that this creature was sitting on a rocking chair. I could never understand this. After thinking about it, though, I think it was maybe to prevent this thing from getting cramps during the move. They also said that the odor was overpowering and enough to make anyone pass out. The combined smells of urine, waste, and body odor was rank. My grandfather stuck by this story until the very end. About 2 weeks before he passed away, my sister reminded me to bring it up again and confront him, which I did. There was no need to go over the story again because we both knew how it went. I just asked him, "Papa, remember the crate you had to move in Jersey?" He looked up at me, smiled, and said, "Of course." I said, "Did you embellish it all?" He said, "No, there was no reason to. It happened the way I said it happened." I said, "Because now would be the time to tell me." He looked at me and said, "You want to know if I embellished the story. The truth is that I am guilty of the opposite. There was so much that I left out. The story was just the beginning. Remember something. I worked there for 2 more years after that. There are things that a young mind should not hear." I said, "But I'm not a child anymore. I am sure I can handle what it is that you have to say." Grandfather said, "I'm an old man, and I'm tired. Tomorrow, I will finish the story. Come back tomorrow." But there was no tomorrow. Grandfather passed away at 2 a.m. that morning in a New York hospital. 2. Bigfoot motions me to come outside. This incident happened in 1976 in Barron County, Wisconsin, and I never told too many people about it. I'm a 46-year-old Native American now, and I was maybe 6 or 7 at the time. It was night, and my sister and cousin were playing around on the phone. They would dial our number and hang up the phone so it would ring. They had music playing really loudly, and they were just playing around. The doorbell rang, and one of us answered the door, but there was no one at the door. Well, this happened 2 or 3 more times. We had a little house dog, and we also had a Saint Bernard, and my sister and cousin noticed that the house dog was crouched under a chair in our living room. The last time the doorbell rang, we all went outside and couldn't see anyone around. We all stood out on the porch. It was maybe a half hour later. My oldest brother went to the refrigerator. The rest of us were playing in the hallway when he came running down the hallway with his hands to his face and crying hysterically. He ran into our parents' room and jumped on the bed, landing on his stomach. He was crying very badly. We all kept asking him what was wrong, and he finally told us what he saw. He said he saw something peeking around the tree, and he said it was motioning to him to come out. That's when he freaked out. After about 15 minutes, he calmed down some. There was knocking at the back door, and the way they were knocking, it was like, "Open the door now." When we opened the door, a guy who lived a few houses away came in as white as a sheet and was shaking pretty badly. He said his car broke down a ways from our place, and when he was walking up the road, he heard something walking in the woods with him. He didn't know what it was. He said he was really glad to see our lights on. Our parents weren't home, but we ended up calling our 2 uncles who lived next door to us. They arrived a few minutes after we called them, and they had their shotguns with them. They came and talked with the guy that came to our house. I think one of my uncles took him home. My uncles went outside to look around. My oldest sister and our cousin wanted to go outside too. Well, when they opened the back door, there was our Saint Bernard. And let me tell you, this was a good-sized dog, and that dog would not let those girls out, and he even growled at them. Well, my sister and cousin backed up from the door, and as they did, the Saint Bernard came running into the house. Well, my sister and cousin still went outside, and as they were standing by this little trail by the house, they noticed some dark form at the bottom of the hill. They thought maybe it was a stump, but then the stump moved and turned to look at them. My cousin said it had red eyes. They came back inside right away. our cousin went out again and went around to the front of the house. And when she got to the corner of our house, she looked up towards my uncle's garage and said she saw something peeking around the garage. She said she thought it was one of our cousins, but she noticed this had a cone-shaped head as it looked around the garage toward our house. They ended up putting us kids to bed. My sister and I were pretty scared, and our little brother didn't really know what was going on. My sister and I were shaking in bed. We really were hoping whatever was out there didn't come to our window. Well, we did see a big figure go by. We were just so scared. It seemed like forever when our parents got home. When they did, we told them what happened. My mother ended up calling a spiritual guide, and he told her that there was probably 3 of those things around the house that night. He also told her that they were looking for a boy to take. He said that one of them may have lost one of their own and came looking for a young boy to replace the one they lost. 3. I Fought the 8 Men. This story written by Fred Beck. First of all, I wish to give an account of the attack and tell of the famous incident of July 1924, when the hairy apes attacked our cabin. We had been prospecting for 6 years in the Mount St. Helens and Lewis River area in southwest Washington. We had, from time to time, come across large tracts by creek beds and springs. In 1924, I and 4 other miners were working our gold claim, the Vanderwhite. It was 2 miles east of Mount St. Helens near a deep canyon now named Ape Canyon, which was so named after an account of the incident reached the newspapers. Hank was a great hunter and a good woodsman, and he was always a little apprehensive after seeing the tracks. The tracks were large, and we knew that no known animal could have made them. The largest measured 19 inches long. It was in the middle of July, and we had evaluated our claim, and everyone was excited. I remember I had a tooth that was aching, and I suggested to Hank that he should take me to town to see a dentist. But he was so enthused in the prospects of the gold mine, he barely took time to answer me. He replied that God or the devil could not get him away from there. We had all come up in his Ford, and I had no way to get to town unless he took me. So when we went back to our cabin on the north side of the canyon, I had a nagging toothache and little appetite for our evening meal of beans and hotcakes. Hank, though apprehensive, was still determined. We had been hearing noises in the evening for about a week. We heard a shrill, peculiar whistling each evening. We would hear it coming from one ridge, and then hear an answering whistling from another ridge. We also heard a sound which I could best describe as a booming, thumping sound, just like something was hitting itself on its chest. Hank asked me to accompany him to the spring, about 100 yards from our cabin, to get some water, and suggested we take our rifles, to be on the safe side. We walked to the spring, and then Hank yelled and raised his rifle, and at that instant, I saw it. It was a hairy creature, and he was about 100 yards away on the other side of a little canyon, standing by a pine tree. It dodged behind the tree and poked its head out from the side of the tree. And at the same time, Hank shot. I could see the bark fly out from the tree from each of his 3 shots. Someone may say that this was quite a distance to see the bark fly, but I saw it. The creature I judged to have been about 7 feet tall with blackish-brown hair. It disappeared from our view for a short time, but then we saw it, running, fast and upright, about 200 yards down the little canyon. I shot 3 times before it disappeared from view. We took the water back to the cabin and explained the affair to the rest of the party, and we all agreed, including Hank, to go home the next morning, as it would be dark before we could get to the car. We agreed it would be unsound to be caught by darkness on the way out. Nightfall found us in our pine log cabin. We had built the cabin ourselves and had made it very sturdy. It stood for years afterward and was visited by many sightseers until a few years ago when it was burned to the ground. The circumstances of the fire I don't recall. In the cabin, we had a long bunk bed in which two could sleep feet to feet, the rest of us sleeping on pine boughs on the floor. At one end of the cabin, we had a fireplace fashioned out of rocks. There were no windows in the cabin, so darkness found all of us in the cabin. More calm now, and my tooth was better. Somehow the excitement seemed to work a temporary cure on it. We were sitting around, puffing on pipes and talking about the trip home the next day. Each of us settled down in his crude but welcomed bed and soon fell asleep. About midnight, we were all awakened. Hank, who was sleeping on the floor, was yelling and kicking, but the noise that had awakened us was a tremendous thud against the cabin wall. Some of the chinking had been knocked loose from between the logs and had fallen across Hank's chest. He had his rifle in his hand and was waving it back and forth as he kicked and yelled. Hank always slept with his gun nearby. It was a Remington automatic, my gun being a .30-30 Winchester, which I still have. I helped to get the chinking off of him, and he jumped to his feet. Then we heard a great commotion outside. It sounded like a great number of feet trampling and rattling over a pile of our unused shakes. We grabbed our guns. Hank squinted through the space left by the chinking. By actual count, we saw only 3 of the creatures together at one time, but it sounded like there were many more. This was the start of the famous attack, of which so much has been written about in Washington and Oregon papers throughout all the years. Most accounts tell of giant boulders being hurled against the cabin, and some say even fell through the roof, but this was not the case. There were very large rocks around in that area. It is true that many smaller ones were hurled at the cabin, but they did not break through the roof, but hit with a bang and rolled off. Some did fall through the chimney of the fireplace. Some accounts state I was hit in the head by a rock and knocked unconscious. This is also not true. The only time we shot our guns that night was when the creatures were attacking our cabin. When they would quiet down for a few minutes, we would quit shooting. I told the rest of the party that maybe if they saw we were only shooting when they attacked, they might realize we were only defending ourselves. We could have had clear shots at them through the opening left by the chinking had we chosen to shoot. We did shoot, however, when they climbed up on our roof. We shot round after round through the roof. We had to brace the huge log door with a long pole taken from the bunk bed. The creatures were pushing against it, and the whole door vibrated from the impact. We responded by firing many more rounds through the door. They pushed against the walls of the cabin, as if trying to push the cabin over. But this was pretty much an impossibility. As previously stated, the cabin was a sturdy made building. Hank and I did most of the shooting. The rest of the party crowded to the far end of the cabin, guns in their hands. One had a pistol, which still is in my family's possession. The others clutched their rifles. They seemed stunned and incredulous. The attack continued the remainder of the night, with only short intervals between. A most profound and frightening experience occurred when one of the creatures, being close to the cabin, reached an arm through the chinking space and seized one of our axes by the handle. A much written about incident, and a true one. Before the thing could pull the axe out, I swiftly turned the head of the axe upright so that it caught on the logs. And at the same time, Hank shot, barely missing my hand. The creature let go and I pulled the handle back in and put the axe in a safe place. A humorous thing I well remember was Hank singing, "If you leave us alone, we'll leave you alone, and we'll all go home in the morning." He did not mean it to be humorous, for Hank was dead serious, and sang under the impression that the mountain devils, as he called them, might understand and go away. The attack ended just before daylight. Just as soon as we were sure it was light enough to see, we came cautiously out of the cabin. It was not long before I saw one of the ape-like creatures, standing about 80 yards away near the edge of Ape Canyon. I shot 3 times, and it toppled over the cliff down into the gorge some 400 feet below. Then Hank said that we should get out of there as soon as possible and not bother to pack our supplies or equipment out. After all, he said, it's better to lose them than our lives. We were all only too glad to agree. We brought out only that which we could get in our pack sacks. We left about $200 in supplies, powder, and drilling equipment behind. I tried to persuade everyone not to relate the happenings to anyone, and they agreed, but Hank soon let the cat out of the bag. We made our way to Spirit Lake, and Hank went into the ranger station. He had told the ranger earlier about the tracks, and the ranger had replied, "Let me know if you find out what they are." And that was just what Hank did, to the puzzlement of the ranger. When we were back home in Kelso, Washington, he told some of his friends, and somehow the story leaked out to the papers, and the great hairy ape hunt of 1924 was on. Local reporters interviewed us. They came from Portland and Seattle. Even a big game hunter from England came asking questions, and he had a large gun with him that must have been an elephant gun. Many people flocked to the Mount St. Helens area looking for the great hairy apes or mountain devils. I myself went back with 2 reporters and a detective from Portland, Oregon. We found large tracks, and they photographed them. We did not see any of the ape men then, nor could we find the ones we had shot. So people were asking questions. Was it true, or was it just a wild tale? I can assure you it is true. Are they human, animal, or devils? That was the Great Ape Hunt of 1924. 4. The following was an article written in 1981 by Ann Cohen, staff writer of the Detroit News Sunday paper. In St. Clair County, Michigan, Cindy Barone isn't sure she wants to call the creature Bigfoot, but something big, hairy, and red-eyed has frightened her family 3 times since September. Something out there roaming the farm fields of Michigan's Thumb area is emitting high-pitched screams by night. It's the unknown that scares us, says Mrs. Barone, whose family last encountered the creature Friday night at their farm home near Yale in St. Clair County. Tina Barone, age 13, said she and her sister Roxanne, age 12, went to the barn to do chores. Roxanne was scared to go into the barn because she'd heard voices in there before, Tina said. I said I would go in first, so I reached in for the light. I felt fur. At first I thought it was a goat or something, so I took my glove off and I touched it again. It didn't look like anything. It was tall with red, bloodshot eyes and big and black and furry and stood on 2 legs. It had a deep growl. Tina told Roxanne to run back to the house. It scared me so bad I had to just run, Roxanne said. I just can't put what it looked like into any kind of form. Tina said she turned and began to walk slowly from the barn, but it started walking out behind me, and I started running. The creature never tried to harm her, Tina said. It let me touch him when I took my glove off, she said. The horses were running around. They were spooked, but it was just curious, whatever it was. The girl's cousin David, 18, got his 16-gauge shotgun to scare the creature away. When it stood there and looked at me, it didn't know what to do, and I didn't either, said Barone. It's unbelievable. It's big. It was some kind of animal, but I can't describe what. It was about 6 feet, 6 or 7 feet. I didn't shoot to kill. I just shot in the air to scare it away. It ran into the woods, making a funny noise. It was standing on 2 feet and had real long arms between a bear and an ape. That's what I think. I've never seen a Bigfoot, so I have no idea if it was one of those. Mrs. Barone, age 33, said their first encounter with the animal came in September when her neighbor's barn door was ripped off at the hinges. I've had fences torn down and grain barrels dumped over and eaten, she said. She said her dogs have raced off into the dark, barking at an unknown intruder, and their farm animals have been spooked by some unknown predator many times. Mrs. Barone said the family is frustrated by the unwillingness of many people, including the local sheriff, to take her story seriously. Mrs. Barone did file a report of the Friday incident with the sheriff's department, but the report contains no mention of her daughter actually seeing an animal. "There was nothing in our report to indicate this," said a department spokeswoman, who speculated that Tina actually felt a raccoon or other small, friendly creature. But Tina is sure she did not feel a typical barnyard animal. "From now on, I'm going to take the camera when I'm doing barn chores in case I see him again, because no one believes us," she said. A mysterious creature called a Sasquatch or Bigfoot that walks on two legs and roams wooded areas from coast to coast has been reported many times. While there is no documented proof of the existence of Bigfoot, films have been made that reportedly show the creature fleeing into a forest, and footprints and other evidence have been uncovered, which has led many people to believe the creatures do exist. "I don't know what it is, but I do know it is something," Mrs. Barone said. 5. I shot at Bigfoot. I used to hunt elk in an area of the Oregon Coast Range known as God's Valley. My best friend's father introduced us to this area. It was a large farmstead in the middle of the Tillamook State Forest that had been abandoned to the state when the owner died in the 1940s. All that was left were several large grass fields surrounded by dense forest. It was prime elk habitat, as the elk would come down to the fields to graze at night. My friend and I noticed some strange things about the area while camping in the summer and hunting in the fall. There was an area about a half-mile from camp we referred to as the Dead Zone. It was a strange area that gave us bad vibes. The forest would be alive with game and game trails, elk, pheasant, squirrel, coyote. Then, almost like crossing a line painted on the ground, there was an area about a quarter-mile long where nothing, and I mean nothing, lived. No game trails, no squirrels barking, not even birds in the trees, no sounds. Even the air was still. Then, a quarter-mile later, you would cross another invisible line, and bam! The forest would be alive again. That was the Dead Zone. September 30th, 1994, I left work that Friday, packed, then headed to God's Valley for the opening day of Coast Black-tailed Deer season. God's Valley was not a real good area for deer, but I was by myself and didn't know any other hunting areas very well. After driving for about 2.5 hours, I left the blacktop and was on the logging roads. At the time, God's Valley was at the end of a dead-end logging road 7 miles from the highway. During elk season, there are dozens of camps and RVs parked along the road and several down at God's Valley. I was quite surprised that when I arrived to the valley at about midnight, it was deserted, and I did not see a single camp or RV the entire way in. I pulled all the way into the large U-shaped clearing. At the bottom of the U was a huge old-growth Douglas fir with a rock fire pit close by. I parked about 30 feet from the tree and left my headlights shining on its base while I set up camp. I had black satin turned way up as I unpacked my truck. About 20 minutes later, I was bent over setting up my dome tent when the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I turned my head, thought I heard a commotion coming from the woods. It was hard to hear over the music. I walked to the driver's door of my truck and turned the music down. I listened and heard nothing. So I shrugged it off, turned my music up, and went back to work. A couple minutes later, I distinctly heard a loud snap of a breaking branch to the left of my camp. I walked to my truck and turned my music off again. I listened intently for at least a minute. Then I heard a very light rustle of leaves and a twig snap. The sound came from the woods on the other side of a 50-foot-long blackberry bush that ended just short of the big old-growth tree. About a minute later, I heard another soft footfall. Then another. At the time, it reminded me of my own sounds when quietly stalking game through the forest. For some reason, I thought it was another hunter or someone playing a joke. I called out, "Hello? Someone there?" Silence. Nothing. About another full minute later, another couple of soft crunches. There's a game trail on the other side of the blackberries. Whatever is making the sound is on the trail and slowly coming closer to where the blackberries end at the base of the tree. By this point, I'm getting nervous. Maybe it's a drunk hunter playing games, but I'm by myself, 7 miles into one of the thickest forests in the U.S. I was carrying a revolver in a shoulder holster. My rifle and speed loaders were cased and underneath a ton of shit behind the seat. I drew my revolver and yelled, "Hey, quit messing around. I got a gun and this shit ain't funny." No response. Nothing. I figured I would either hear a man running away, busting brush of an animal running, or something, but there was only silence. About a minute later, I can hear more creeping steps along the trail. It's getting closer to the gap between the blackberries and the tree, perhaps 30 feet away now. My headlights are shining on the bottom of the tree, but I still can't see anything. I made the loudest, most guttural scream I could muster. I could hear it echo through the valley. More silence. A minute later, more quiet, stalking footsteps. I'm 6'3", 260 pounds. It sounds like a man my size or better, trying to be quiet. 2 legs? I see a large shadow move into the gap and behind the tree. The tree is about 5 feet wide. I am now scared for my life. I fire around high up into the tree. The gunshot echoed for a long time. I saw part of a tall shape and yellowish eyes peer at me from behind the tree. I screamed as loud as I could and fired 2 more shots into the tree. The shots echoed for a long time, then silence. I didn't see it anymore. I stood there waiting. I had 2 or 3 shots left. I wasn't sure. After about a half a minute, it just walked away into the woods. It was no longer trying to be quiet, but it wasn't in a hurry. It just walked away into the darkness. I listened for a couple minutes until I couldn't hear it anymore. I picked up my entire setup, dome, tent, and all, threw it in the back of my truck. I threw my pots, pans, and cooler and everything else on top. I was out of there and back on the gravel road 90 seconds later. I drove the 2.5 hours back to Portland, shaking. I arrived at my friend's house at about 3 in the morning. I woke him up and told him what happened. The next afternoon, we packed several rifles and drove back. I had to show him and see if we could find anything. It looked much different in the daylight. We parked at the base of the tree and looked around. On the trail behind the tree, we could clearly see its prints in the soft earth. Its prints were almost half again as large as my size 13 boots. The footprints were so far apart that I had to stretch my legs as far as they would go to match the stride. Since then, I no longer go into the forest alone. You have just heard 5 true stories of Bigfoot encounters from different parts of the country and different time periods. You can choose to believe them or not. But remember, to the ones recounting the stories, it was one of the most frightening experiences of their lives. I'm Steve White. Until next time.